The M26 Pershing was the last and most powerful American tank to enter service during World War II. With armor and firepower similar to that of the German Tiger I, it was a significant step up from the 75mm and 76mm Shermans that still made up the bulk of America's armored forces. Despite this, the first of these to reach Europe would not do so until early 1945, when the war was practically over. So this begs the question: what took the M26 Pershing so long? The simple answer is that it simply wasn't available any sooner, with it only entering production in November of 1944. However, if you're anything like me, that answer is not a very satisfying one. So in this video, I'll be trying to give a more comprehensive answer to this question, and I'll be doing so using an analogy that I think most of us can compare to, that being a model kit. Now, aside from this being a perfect way to shamelessly plug ConeOfArc.store, where you can support my channel by buying model kits, I think it works quite well to explain this topic. Just like a model kit, or in this case a Kobe set, takes a variety of different parts to assemble, the development of the M26 Pershing is made up of a variety of different pieces. And obviously, if you want to get anywhere with the build, you have to know how to build it. So we'll start there. The US clearly understood that a better tank than the M4 would be needed, with the development of a replacement beginning just after production began in early 1942. This resulted in the first mock-up of what would be designated as medium tank T-20 to be finished and approved in May of 1942. As you may or may not know, the M26 Pershing was a product of the T-20 series of vehicles, beginning with the T-20 itself, and eventually resulting in the T-26E3, which was accepted and designated as the M26 Pershing. To go into the full T-20 program would take far too long and largely be irrelevant to the main topic of this video, as most of the important developments to create Pershing would not come until later in development. However, I'll be creating a rough timeline to give the necessary context between the M4 Sherman and the M26 Pershing. Again, I won't be going in depth on these vehicles here, but I may do so in a future video, and both the Chieftain and Red Wrench films have videos covering this topic. And what better way to do a timeline than with the YouTuber's trusty tool of the whiteboard? That's right, we're doing a Pershing timeline. So starting from 1942 and all the way to February of 1945, which is when the Pershing saw combat, we're going to slowly fill this in with all the different pieces to build the eventual M26 Pershing. And that starts all the way back, not quite in January of 1942, but February, with the first Sherman rolling off the production line. This is followed shortly after by the T-20 mock-up. Now, while the T-20 was the first to see a mock-up built of it, it was not the first to see a metal prototype. That would actually be the T-23. The first T-23 prototype would be completed months later in January of 1943. All of these were fairly similar looking designs, armed with the 76mm gun and featuring a lower profile than the M4. Of these three, the T-23 was by far the best design, with production of it starting in October of 1943. Unfortunately for the T-23, it was essentially dead on arrival, with the T-23 turret being taken and placed on the Sherman in June of 1943. Sure, the T-23 may have been better on paper, but the Sherman had already been in production for over a year by this point and had already seen a lot of combat, so you can kind of see why they would go with a proven design over something that was just entering production and had not gone through the proper testing yet. Now, ignoring all of this, which you can kind of see as the lead up towards the M26 Pershing, the most significant step towards its production would occur in January of 1944, with both the T-25 prototype and approval for a limited production run of T-25E1s. The following month, the same would occur with the T-26 and T-26E1. I know it can be a little confusing that sometimes later model number production vehicles were created before the earlier ones, but don't blame me, blame the US Ordnance Department. Critically though, these two tanks would feature the 90mm gun, with the T-26E1 also featuring thicker armor. Production of the 40 T-25E1s and 10 T-26E1s as part of the pre-production run would finish in May of 1944. Finally, in November of 1944, T-26E3 would be approved for production, which would go on to become M26 Pershing, seeing combat in February of 1945. So now that we have a rough timeline of the events, let's get into our next segment where we'll talk about the production issues with the T-25 and T-26. Both the T-25 and T-26 were pretty quickly relegated to just prototypes due to them being planned to use electric drives, which significantly increased the weight of the tanks. So the T-25E1 and T-26E1 got rid of that in favor of a torque-matic transmission, which is essentially just a fancy term for what we know as an automatic transmission. The T-26E1 increased the frontal armor thickness of the T-25E1 from 3 inches, 76.2 millimeters, to 4 inches, 101.6 millimeters. Aside from that, both were also now fitted with torsion bar suspension, finally eliminating the volute spring suspension from the Sherman, essentially the last remaining link between the M4 and the T-20 series. Now, aside from some concerns over these new designs, which we'll get into in the next section, the testing of the first batch of tanks pretty quickly proved they were not ready for full-scale production. T-25E1 was eventually dropped from consideration due to its thinner armor compared to the T-26. The T-26E1 itself proved to be a fairly satisfactory tank, but it had its own share of flaws, with significant issues in the drivetrain and cooling systems. This is where the T-26E3 comes in, with it implementing the necessary fixes to the design, finally entering production in November of 1944. Just like getting a brand new model kit in the mail doesn't mean you instantly have a completed model to put on your shelf to display, having a production vehicle doesn't mean that it's ready to enter combat right off the production line. Aside from the fact that you have to ship the thing overseas and build the things to begin with, you also have to do testing to make sure that there's nothing critically wrong with the design. Although we'll get more into this in the next segment, it's worth emphasizing here that while it may seem like the US was being overly cautious with how long it took from the Pershing being first developed to be put into combat, you have to remember just the amount of effort that it took to get a tank from the US to Europe at that time. Not only did these things have to be shipped thousands of miles from the factory to a front line where there were no spare parts for them, but there were also no crews or mechanics trained to deal with them when something inevitably went wrong. I'm getting ahead of myself though, so let's jump to the next segment where we can start to put all the pieces of the Pershing together.
On the First Army front, a newly arrived T-26E3 is inspected by General Hodges and his staff officers. Increasing numbers of these tanks are seeing extensive action in the Rhine offensives.
While you could make an argument that the M26 or T-25E1 or T-26E1 could have been rushed into production quicker, we once again have to blame our friend, the M4 Sherman, for that. For as much hate as the Sherman gets and the limited effectiveness of the 76mm against the bigger cats, you have to remember that these things were still putting up a very solid fight against the Germans and Japanese even into 1945. Sure, it may not have been able to 1v1 a King Tiger, but remember that the US really didn't encounter all that many of the big cats compared to the far more numerous types of German armor like the older Panzers or various tank destroyers and self-propelled guns. While the 90mm gun and thicker armor of the T-26E1 and M26 definitely helped, it still wasn't enough to reliably stop the German anti-tank guns or engage the feline foes. It's important to remember that not only were these particular vehicles relatively rare, but tank-on-tank combat was rarely the primary purpose of a tank on the battlefield. This is where we run into one of the biggest concerns with the M26 and the 90mm gun in general, that being ammo capacity. This is a topic the US has been fairly picky about, basically as long as tanks have been part of the armed forces, including World War II. Tanks such as the famous M4A3E8 EZ8 could carry 71 rounds of 76mm ammo. The T-26, on the other hand, could only carry 42. This is already a significant decrease, but this is made worse by the point we already discussed about tank combat being relatively uncommon compared to engaging things like field guns, machine gun positions, or massed infantry. This means that a tank, especially in World War II, would want a healthy supply of high explosive, as the solid armor-piercing ammo isn't going to be all that much help in those scenarios. While this could be somewhat increased to 60 rounds by replacing the hull machine gunner with additional ammo storage, the bow machine gun was considered too important to remove. This was eventually resolved with tweaks to the design, allowing for 70 rounds to be carried in the tank. Aside from that, there was also the hesitancy towards adopting a new unproven tank design, as we already discussed. A new tank doesn't just mean a need for new spare parts, but it also means training crews to operate them and mechanics to repair them. It's also important to remember how critical things like weight were, not just for transportation, but also the ability to cross rivers. You can have the greatest tank in the world, but it doesn't really matter if the first time it encounters a river, it can't cross because there are no bridges capable of supporting it. Although, as we discussed in one of my previous videos, the idea that American tanks were not meant to fight tanks was a misconception, there is some truth to the fact that there was hesitancy around adopting a 90mm gun in a tank rather than a tank destroyer. So now that we have all the pieces to our Kobe M26 Pershing from ConeOfArc.store in front of us, let's put them all together and wrap this video up. So what's the full answer to why the M26 Pershing took so long to reach combat? Well, the truth of the matter is, it wasn't until essentially 1945 that all the pieces were there to put the thing into action. Just like you can't complete a model kit if you open it up and it has pieces missing, you simply could not have gotten the M26 to Europe before that point. The need and desire for a 90mm gun really didn't appear until after June of 1944 with the Normandy landings. Even following that, the introduction of the 76mm gun improved the Sherman's capabilities enough to keep the fight going until the push into Germany finally revealed just how undergunned the tank would be against the latest in German armor. This is not to glaze the Sherman, as I'm sure some of you are writing a 50-paragraph long comment about right now, as there was certainly an argument to be made that the 76 and 90mm should have been adopted sooner and that it was a mistake for the US not to do so. However, when you take a step back from the War Thunder and World of Tanks mindset regarding tank combat, there really wasn't much that would change the fate of the Pershing. Earlier introduction of those guns would have just meant Sherman-based designs being prioritized, just like with the T-23. The added armor of the Pershing was also still not really reliable in stopping the 88mm, and especially not the long 88mm, and you would have needed something like the T-26E5 or T-32 to do so. I have a video on those if you're interested. So while it's easy to point to something like the T-25E1 and T-26E1 being put into production earlier in 1944, it's understandable why the US was hesitant to rush something like this across the Atlantic into combat. The Germans, Soviets, and even the British to some extent had the benefit of being far closer to the action, meaning their tanks could be put into combat sooner in theory. Even if they suffered issues in the field, shipping parts to the front or taking the tank back to the factory were still a potential option. Look at the earlier example of the M6 heavy tank, which saw limited production but never reached combat because for the weight of one M6, several M4s could be loaded on a ship. Did this hesitation sadly result in the death of more American tankers that could have otherwise been avoided? Maybe, but at the same time, rushing an unproven vehicle into combat may have been just as bad, if not worse. But what do you think? Did I miss anything in my conclusion? Let me know down in the comments, and if you want to build your own T26E3, M26 Pershing, or check out videos on the T20 series, I'll leave some links down below in the description. Thanks as always for watching, and a shout out to all my ConelyFans for supporting this content through their YouTube memberships. If you liked this video, you'll probably enjoy my video on the T26E5 and T32 heavy Pershings. Or if you've already seen that one, YouTube thinks you'll like this one. I'll see you there or in my next video.